I will go ahead and get started and introduce us and get us right into our topic today. So welcome everyone to the 5th installment of the MenHealing series. My name is Dr. Sarah Walters. I am a project coordinator at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and I'll be sort of hosting and the kind of behind the scenes a little bit today. So if you need anything at all, you're welcome to private message me or anyone that has NSVRC next to their name should be able to help you out. This webinar series is a collaboration with MenHealing, the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center as a deliverable for the Male Survivors Project, as many of you I'm sure are familiar with. This project is meant to help folks understand how male socialization impacts the stigma and reaction to sexual violence, and also consider how to reach and engage men who need healing from sexual violence. The project also helps advocates and agencies map out potential partnerships in their service area and provides guidance on creating sexual assault services that meet the needs of male survivors. I do just want to cover a couple of housekeeping things before I turn it over to our presenters today. We ask that anyone who may have a question that you use the Q&A function to submit that question. Please do not put your questions in the chat. We want our facilitators to be able to address those questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions along the way, please click the Q&A button, and then you can submit your question there to be addressed later. I want to remind folks who may be trickling in now to please use the interpretation button if you need to switch your language channel. I will give folks just a moment. So in order to keep going with introductions, I do want to pass it over to our presenters today. So Sharon, if you would like to go ahead and jump right in.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I am Sharon. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. As you know, I'm one of the presenters for this series. I work full-time at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center and volunteer time to MenHealing. So I'm a member of both. I want to acknowledge that our third presenter is not here. Kenton is taking care of baby Carter. We miss him, but we honor his time with his family. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And before I talk about today's session, I'm going to pass it off to Jim to introduce himself.
Yes, welcome everyone. I'm Jim Struve, and I'm Executive Director with MenHealing.
And just an all-around amazing person and a good friend of mine. So that's important to acknowledge that. I like to have fun together. So one thing I want to put out in the ether, we were talking behind the scenes earlier before we jumped on, that we have many interpreters and captioners on these sessions to really make this as accessible as possible to everyone. And so with that, we are going to be taking it slow and talking slow to make sure that we are getting all the information to everyone as they need. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I also want to honor the many interpreters and captioners that we have on this webinar. So thank you all so much for your work and providing this information to the folks on these webinar series. So welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about safety. And I don't know if you noticed, but on the slide in front of you, safety is in quotes. And we're going to, as we go through the presentation, you're going to understand why safety is put in quotes. And as when we very often ask the question of providers, what do survivors need? One of the first things that usually comes up is safety or a safe space. And so it's something that we're going to talk about today, but why is that they need a safe space? What is a safe space? How do we talk about it? How do we talk about it when working with men? And these are all things that we're going to be exploring today as we talk about safety. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it off to you, Jim.
Yeah, our overarching goal today is that we want to share with you our experience of working with men survivors to develop their own sense of safety to support the process of healing. That's the overarching goal we have. Next slide. And the objectives that we hope you'll take away is we hope that each of you will gain maybe an increased recognition that safety is not the same for everyone. We hope each one of you will learn that including survivors in developing what they need for safety enhances their healing process. And then third, that each of you will learn some tools for active engagement in co-creating safety for survivors that you work with to help them develop what they need to be able to engage in their healing process. Next slide.
And we appreciate folks already putting their information in the chat. If you haven't already, please feel free to do so. It's important to have everyone's voice here for everyone to be seen, and really recognizing that as we go through, we're going to invite you to engage more in the concept of being safe and bringing more of yourselves into the space and thinking about how you can do that. But I do want to acknowledge that we've got folks from all over the country, Alaska, Alabama, New Hampshire, Missouri, Michigan, Wisconsin, Utah, my home state of Massachusetts, Missouri, I think I said Michigan, South Carolina, Texas, and West Virginia. And we have a visitor from South Africa. So welcome. We are really glad that the work we are doing is reaching far and wide, and that all of you are really here to understand how to work with men who've experienced sexual harm and how to build safety. So thank you all for being here. And we just got someone who said they're here from Kentucky. So thank you all for being here and being present. We invite you to continue to stay present, and we are going to focus more today on safety for ourselves and for the men that we work with. Next slide, and I'll pass it off to you, Jim.
Next slide, please. So jumping right in, there's a question on the screen, and imagine that we decided that we're going to change, and rather than us presenting to you, we were going to make this experiential and interaction. And just notice for yourself, and maybe you can enter into the chat interactively, what do you believe are the most important aspects of safety when working with survivors? What are some things that come to mind? If rather than telling our clients, we will make it safe for you, what do you think would be important to know to ask the people we work with? What are the aspects? Physical and emotional safety, emotional, trust, holistic approach, offering agency, survivors being able to say anything and not worry about the reaction, what they think is safe for them, ask them what their idea of safe is. Understanding it's not the same for everyone. Clearly conveyed client-centered focus. Just be aware that as you're noticing these replies in the chat, that safety and this question is really on a spectrum, on a continuum. It's not just a set block identified answer. Having no judgment. Okay, thank you for your input. Let's go on to the next slide. What I want to ask you now, if we had actually moved forward with this being experiential engagement, what are you aware of was your body reaction to that question? What are you aware of is happening in your body when you even think, what do I need to be safe? Rather than in your head, a cognitive answer, what happens for you? How do you know what would be safe? And how do you pay attention to the cues you're getting? We need to remember, as we've been talking about through the other sections in this series, that sexual harm is a body violation, a body experience. It's also an emotional experience, and it's also a cognitive experience. So safety has multi-levels of a reaction. And it's really important that we, as providers, advocates, whatever our role is, that we pay attention to the somatic experiences that surround the issue of safety, so we don't just move people into the illusion of safety without the full body, holistic, real experience of safety. And it's important for us that we pay attention to our reactions as we're observing the reactions of the survivors that we're engaging with. Next slide, pass on to Sharon.
And so as you think about how you approach safety when working with survivors, there are some key things I want to go back to from our previous session, the SEEK model, which was safety, empowerment, empathy, connection, and knowledge. And so to reiterate, it's really important for us all to understand that safety is not equitable. The idea and concept of safety is a large part of the mental health field, which we know is really influenced by white supremacy culture, and really who gets to decide what safety is and what that looks like. So it's important for us to make it very individualistic. And the reality that there might have been some survivors who've never experienced safety, such as growing up in an abusive household or having an identity which is when safety is not guaranteed. I'm thinking of folks of color, I'm thinking of trans folks. And what is safe for one person is not safe for another. You know, very often in our field, we think about reporting to the police. That may not be safe for a man of color or a trans individual, or going to therapy may not feel safe based on perceptions of therapy or past experiences in therapy, or that sometimes therapy is often seen as a punishment. It's part of someone's sort of release program, et cetera. As Jim mentioned before, it's also really important to acknowledge that safety is on a continuum. So it's safer, safe enough, but that it's on a continuum from 0 to whatever you and your clients decide. But it's important to understand that safety is never completely guaranteed, and that healing is still possible and effective even if safety isn't completely guaranteed. And then it's also really important to recognize that safety may not be the thing that they need. I think I mentioned last time we talked about this, is that very often folks are surprised when we ask them what is safety for them. Very often it's an assumption. It's not something that people actually asked about. So again, ABC, always be curious, ask about these things. It's what do they need to be able to engage with you to get their needs met? That's what we're looking for. And it could be trust, could be comfort, could be respect. It could be many different things. It could be safety. But really giving a space for it to be something in particular to that individual, that equity lens that we've talked about many times before. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Something about peas. I don't know what I'm saying. So now we want you to engage in the understanding of safety. We ask it of our clients. We talk about it with our clients, but I want us to turn it in for us to talk about it in this space. So I want to ask all of you, and please feel free to share in the chat. And then as you're sharing, I invite people to take a look at what's being shared in the chat and your responses to what's being shared. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the exercise and share some of those things. So the question for you is, what do you need in this session to be able to engage enough to get your needs met? So again, the question is, what do you need in this session to be able to engage enough to get your needs met? And I'll give it a few moments. So one of the responses we got was proximity, eye contact, tone of voice, posture. Body language and tone. And so even with the examples that have been given, think about What eye contact do you need? What tone of voice do you need? It's okay. Yes. Can I reframe the question? I basically want to know, we're in this session, we're going to talk about safety, something that we often bring up to our clients, but I wonder for ourselves how often we bring it up for us and think about it for ourselves. And so challenging ourselves to think about, what do you need to be safe in this webinar? To feel comfortable? To not feel judged? Transparency and saying the things that are hard to talk about? Time to think and write? I have a tremor and have trouble writing quickly. Great. So us being slow, I want to, again, remind ourselves of that. For others to treat me as an equal, not to feel judged. Okay. Just to remind folks, any questions that come through, we're going to be put in the Q&A, and we'll address those a little bit later. I often feel on the defensive of LGBTQIA survivors. I often need to know that presenters feel the same passion to support queer survivors to be able to be in the presentation fully. This is important, right? To think about, what do we need as individuals? And as we go through, is how do we know what we're getting, what we need? What does that feel like for us? How is that in our bodies? So the reason why we're going through this, again, really wanting to make it interactive and to do it this way, is to have us have an understanding, right? That empathy towards what it's like for a survivor to be asked these questions. And I want you all to reflect for a moment, what was it like for you to be asked this question? You don't have to share in the chat, but just to reflect for yourself, what was it like for you to be asked this question? So as we move forward, again, these are the questions that we need to engage in when working with men survivors, to have conversations. Our friend Kenton always says to investigate what safety is and what it means for that person individually, and then to investigate, like, how do they know they get what they need, and having conversations about that. Next slide, please. So let's move into that a little bit. I sort of jumped ahead of myself. And so we asked what you needed, and we got several examples of what folks need. You don't have to share this in the chat, but this is a moment for you. I would like you to reflect. How do you know that is what you need? And how do you know when you get what you need? Just want you to take a moment and sit with those questions. And I'm going to read some more prompt questions just to bring it a little bit deeper. But first, let's start with, how do you know that that is what you need? And how do you know when you get what you need? Someone in the chat had said it was hard to answer. I really had to think about what I need. People do not ask that very often. So we have to be able to ask ourselves the questions that we're asking of others and leave space for the surprise of actually being asked. So as we go through these questions, I want us to bring in the body. The body tells us a lot if we listen to it. We've talked about being present throughout our many sessions, and being present is being present and aware of your body and what it's doing, and then listening to what it's telling us. So as you reflect on the questions, what do you need and how do you know when you get it? I want you to think about what's going on in your body right now. How is it responding to these questions? And again, for your own personal reflection, you don't need to share, because I want you to be in it. What is your body telling you? How is your body telling you? And reflecting back to the previous question, what do you need to be able to engage in this webinar? What did you notice about your body's response to that question, to that invitation? And so throughout this webinar, we are going to be asking a lot of questions for our own self-reflection, for our own understanding around safety so that we can talk to others about it. And what I really invite you to do is to pay attention to notice any somatic or physical responses to the questions, because again, it'll tell us a lot. So that's just an invitation to take from now moving through to just notice what your body's responses are, what your body is doing, and try to listen to what your body is telling you. Next slide, please. Okay. So what's also really important to recognize is when we are working with survivors is there's two of us in the room, at least, if not more. So it's important to both address what we need from ourselves and others. And so the first question I want to ask all of you, and do please feel free to share in the chat if you would like, is thinking about for ourselves and our own internal sense of quote unquote safety. What do you need from yourself to be safe enough to participate in this session? So thinking about what do you need from yourself to be able to participate? So I'm going to give it a moment. What do you need from yourself to participate? What do you need from yourself to be safe enough to participate in this session? Food, water, I say water where I'm from, food, water, and a comfy blanket. I need to know that I'm in a safe space to participate. And Diana, thinking about what that is for you, how do you know when you're in a safe space for you? Safe, quiet space to sleep, leaving my feelings at the door. When I feel at peace. You know, I also want to highlight that, again, it's really important to think about asking ourselves the same questions we ask of the folks that we're working with. And what does it feel like to even be asked the question or to be considered that your safety is also important? Food in a blanket. I don't want to be judged, feel validated. Need to be centered. I need to have water. Be in the right headspace to breathe. Also, dog snuggles help. They do. Research has shown animals help. So what I want everyone to do is to take a look at the chat and see what people are sharing. And I want you to notice, how does that feel? I want us to imagine that we're in a space together, right? An actual physical space together. And to have people relating these ideas of what they need from themselves to be safe and how it feels for you to be reading these things. So again, imagine we're in a space together. And how does it feel to be looking and hearing these responses? Makes me feel comfortable. Right, I'm going to put out there that the comfortability might come from the ideal of feeling very validated, not feeling alone or normalized in what you're experiencing. Okay, let's take that into the next slide. Thank you. And so as I mentioned, we are part of this, and others are also part of this community that we're building right here on this webinar. And so another question that's important for us to ask ourselves is, what do you need from others to be safe enough to participate in this session? Right, there's from us and there's from others. And others are other participants in this webinar, and the others are also us as facilitators. So thinking about, what do you need from others to be safe enough to participate in this session? Empathy an openness to listen and be wrong, respect, be heard but not in the spotlight, mutual support in the learning process, that I know what I'm doing, trust that I know what I'm doing. I just want, as an observation, it's interesting when I asked the question about what we need from ourselves, the comments were a lot slower. When we recognize or asked what we need from others, the comments seem to be coming a little bit faster. And that's just an interesting thing to pay attention to and notice. Also, continue to notice your bodily responses to the questions that are being asked. And again, that tells us a lot of information. And again, continue to look at the chat as people share. And again, notice how it feels for you, again, to have your thoughts and feelings validated. Again, imagine we're in a space together, sharing this and what that would feel like to be in that space. And I want us to take that idea of being together in this space, the idea of exploring for ourselves these ideas before we explore them with clients. And as we do that, I want to move in and segue to Jim. So next slide, please.
One of the key approaches that MenHealing is using to work with men who've had sexual harm is to create spaces where the survivors can make connections with other people. And what we hope is that community will grow out of that as a way to end isolation and to help people reestablish relationship interactions. So here's a tool that you may take away from today and may be able to use, a safety step-in exercise. And I've used this individually, one-on-one with clients. We do it in group, and we do it at our weekends of recovery. Let me just walk you through so you'll kind of get a sense of the model. At our weekends of recovery, we may have 14, 16, 18, up to 28 survivors there at a time. And we start the experience by sitting in a circle. And one of the first things we do during the time together is say, we're going to address safety. And as Sharon was talking before, what's been characteristic, we've now, I think I mentioned this in the other presentations, we've done 101 weekends of recovery. And still to this day, when we ask that question, let's talk about safety and what you need, most of the people still say, I've never been asked that question before. And so it's a little confusing, probably like it is for some of us here today too. I don't even know quite how to answer the question or what to think of it. So what we do is we structure it rather than a brainstorm, rather than using newsprint or an easel, or rather than just having us kind of put the things out verbally into space. We ask everyone physically to stand in a circle, stand up, and we want to, each time we ask a question, step in to ask or to give your response. And then anybody else who shares that response, step in as well. For example, we'll probably start with a test question. What's your favorite color? Okay, one person may step in and say blue. Anybody else who likes blue as one of your favorite colors, step in. One, several, maybe none will step in. Step back into the circle. Another person, what's your favorite color? Purple. Same thing. If you like purple, step in. So we walk through that, and then we move into, we have a series of 10 key questions. And I'm going to just put them up on the screen. You'll get these in your available through your handouts for the future. Feel free to use them generously. These are the ones that we've developed over the course of our 101 weekends. But here's the first 5. And one of the things that we've found really important, and we've made a change, is to ask first something that's positive and affirming before we jump into the negatives. We used to say, what have you done that hasn't been safe or healthy? Now what we do is we say, what is one thing you already do that is safe and healthy? Part of it is to help people internalize what their progress may already be, even just out of sheer survival, things that are working. And then the follow-up is once you have a context of one or a few things that are safe, that are healthy, what are things that you've done that may not be so healthy? And then we move into trying to reinforce this is a physical body experience, not just a cognitive exercise. So again, very early, this is like within probably the hour of us starting our session. How do you know in your body when I feel unsafe? And probably it goes without saying that a lot of you have the experience. Survivors learn to not be in their bodies. We all learn to check out, to not be connected. And so we begin to integrate the idea of knowing how to read your body and making it safe enough to access and express. And then we move into the way that's beginning to form community. What do I need from others? We try whenever possible for groups for the weekends of recovery to have as diverse an audience participants as possible. So we a lot of times, in answering one of the questions that came up in a chat earlier, we sometimes have people on the same weekend who have different beliefs about sexual orientation or gender presentation. And it's really helpful for us to create the space where everyone is welcome and everyone learns to be open and collaborative with the other people. And one of the things we really found fascinating over the time we've been doing our weekends is how many people who come in with what might be somewhat of a rigid or excluding values and leave having really shifted and opened up because they see the humanness of the people that they used to other. And it's really important that we help with that shift. But again, the step-in exercise is an activity that's physical, not just cognitive. And I invite you again to consider, you can do this with clients one-on-one in your interactions as well. So if you're an emergency intake worker and advocate, one of the things you might want to do before you rush in and begin the processing of the intervention, stop along and say, before we start, I'm here to help you, but I need to ask first, what do you need to be safe with me as the person who's going to be talking with you, working with you for a while? And if you can, take even the brief amount of time to have the question posed and to be receptive to hearing what someone might say. And sometimes we might be surprised what someone would most need for us to be with them as they enter the process of getting help. But we can't assume that now that you're here with me as the advocate, you're safe. Now that you're here in the emergency room, you're safe. Those are assumptions. And we need to know prior. Next slide. I'm not going to go through all these, but just the sequence that we then ask people to check on themselves. What do they need from themselves? And then we lead them through what do you need from others around you? And we begin to introduce the idea we are a community. And even when I'm one-on-one working with the client, I may see now that you're here in my office, now that we've established this starting point to work together, I work with other people just like you. I've talked to other survivors. I am a survivor myself, and I share that openly. And now we are beyond just one-on-one. It's important to begin to help to introduce that, which leads to the ninth one here about this is a possibility of moving beyond isolation, beyond living an isolated, invisible life. And then always it's important to not assume that we've asked all the important questions, but say, is there anything else that I didn't ask that I need to know about how to make this safe for you? And what you'll notice before I move on to the next slide is that, again, what we're doing is engaging the survivor in the process rather than us delivering the container of safety. And so we're co-creating, we're doing, and that goes back to what Sharon was just talking about, that it's hard to co-create a space if we're not also part of the equation. And so we begin to introduce what we need to be safe to work with someone. And an example might be, and this might be done just strictly on your own, separate from the survivor even knowing, with one particular person, I might not need to do it in the office alone at 8 o'clock at night when no one else is around. This is a client or a survivor that I would be better equipped to work with when I know there's someone in the next room. Those are things to pay attention to, not to ignore, and to challenge our own beliefs that as providers, we should be above having feelings, that we should be above having any needs or reactions. It's not true. In reality, we need things for safety as well. Next slide, Sharon.
Thank you, Jim. So we have talked a lot about what we need from ourselves, from others in this space. And a lot of it comes down to, as people have said, trust, respect, comfort. And so we're teetering between asking ourselves the questions. How do we engage the men we're working with in these questions? So now we're going to come back to how do we as providers set up the space and the place to have these conversations, right? That mutual learning space. And so for us as providers, it is important for us to uplift that safety, respect, and comfort of the folks we're working with by really challenging the assumptions that we have about men survivors. Way back in the beginning of this webinar series, we had talked about barriers. It's not the survivors that have barriers. It is us as providers, as folks involved in institutions and systems that actually have the assumptions. And so we were putting together this presentation, the three of us, Jim, Kent, and I had talked a lot about some of the assumptions that we had made in starting to do this work and how important it is for us to be vulnerable in this space and share some of those things, assumptions and beliefs that we had that really led us to correct the work that we're doing. And it is important to acknowledge those things. And as someone said, to get it wrong. It's okay to get it wrong as long as we acknowledge it, take ownership of it, and then make the change. So, by the way, I'm looking at another screen because I have two screens here. I wanted to be transparent about why I'm looking away from the camera itself. And that some of the things that we talked about was that we are safe people because we are therapists. And thinking about for yourself, have you had that assumption? And again, therapy might be court-ordered. People have their own history of therapy or perceptions of therapy based on history. And so we can't assume because we are providers that we are safe. I am a cisgendered woman. And I think a lot when I started this work, I assumed that I'm a woman, right? Women are nurturing and that I wouldn't be unsafe for a man who came to services. I quickly learned that that was not true, that women are also offenders. And so I think an assumption we have is that women aren't offenders when they are. And so I could be someone that could represent the offender or someone who might represent someone who didn't protect them, such as a mom from the offender in the household. So those are definitely some things that I have needed to reflect on. I think through that, it's understanding that we need to see ourselves through the lenses of the people that we're working with, is understanding their history, understanding who they are, understanding what they're coming in with so we can look through that lens and not assume that because I'm a woman therapist that I'm a safe person. And so we had talked about the red, yellow, and green light system, I think last session, and really being able to utilize that tool to think about, for this person, how am I a red light person? How am I someone who is not safe or comforting or respectful in that space? How am I a green light person? What am I doing? What can I do in this space, such as be aware of my assumptions that allow me to be a green light person? And to very honestly recognize through the lens of the people that are coming in, that are probably yellow light people, that there's a lot of caution for many different reasons, and understanding that caution and having conversations about what safety, trust, or comfort or respect is for them, and being able to provide it as much as we can. Again, recognizing it's on that continuum. So keeping that relationship very fluid and also really continuing to talk about the idea of safety. Next slide, please. We make mistakes. acknowledging that we make mistakes. And I think there's a lot of reparative work that can be done if we acknowledge the mistakes that we make. Don't excuse them, don't rationalize them, own them, and then you can make change. So that's important to do, and it can be hard to do. I want to acknowledge that as well. With MenHealing, one of the exercises we did was to teach men to bigify. And we realized through our work with some men that to bigify, particularly for certain cultures or certain folks because of their identities, actually felt very unsafe to do that. So we recognized that to bigify wasn't the right thing because we're asking people to make themselves take up space, to make themselves aware, be in the spotlight. Someone mentioned that earlier. But really what we want people to do is to fully inhabit their own body, to feel as if they're inhabiting their body from head to toe, but not to make themselves bigger in a space outside of themselves. That it was really important for us to learn, as many men, particularly men of color, talked about the idea of posing and posturing and what that meant for them as a safety measure, but didn't really mean to be fully in their bodies. And then for some folks, thinking about, again, being too big in a space or taking up space actually made them feel very unsafe. And so we needed to be really thoughtful and make those changes about that. Mistakes made, right? Again, as I mentioned before, I assumed as I was a woman and a therapist that I was safe. And I often share this example. I had a man client who came in to see me in my private practice, and I'm only 5'3", I have a big personality. So of course I seem like I'm taller, but he was tall and bigger, older man. And when he came in and saw me, he collapsed on himself. He became very small. And compact, I think, as a safety measure for himself. And here I was assuming, like, why would that be the case? And he asked me 3 questions when he started. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked down and he said, how old are you? Are you straight? And are you going to hurt me? Which is 3 interesting questions, right? And so conversating and talking with him about why it was important for him to understand all of those things. And I understood by asking him the questions that not only was he abused by men, he was also abused by women. And so giving that space for that. So making sure to, again, address our assumptions and make room for mistakes and honor them. Also, too, I think for myself, again, I'll talk for myself, is that I was not conditioned to believe that men had feelings and emotions. I was not conditioned to be able to see and witness men crying. So I would very often in that space notice that I would go more towards infantilizing versus caregiving. And that's not helpful for anyone. That's not empowering. That's not uplifting the survivor and their experience and their skills. So it was really important for me to understand that the mistake I was making was going past caregiving and into infantilization. Because again, I didn't recognize my own conditioning. So just being able to take space and to really be aware of the mistakes that we're making and honor them. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it off to you, Jim.
To whatever degree you have control over the space that you're doing when you have your interactions with men who are survivors, I really invite you to think about how you can have the most flexibility to adapt your space, building on what we're talking about here, that one size doesn't fit all, that people have different needs. So just some examples I'll offer from my own experience. I've always been very clear with my office space to notice what kind of furniture I have and where it's positioned. And things like where your waiting room is in relationship to your office. So some of these that may be totally familiar to you and some may be somewhat new is in my office, I may want to have a white noise sound machine so that the sound doesn't go out through the door so people in the waiting room can hear. Just having that gives the person an awareness that I am attending to safety. When I come to greet a person, I say, would you like me to walk first or would you like me to walk behind you? Again, not an assumption. One may be safer for one person, the other for someone different. I have chosen to always have modular furniture that I can move and reposition rather than just a stationary couch. And to have my desk in a position where I don't have to sit behind my desk. I can be in a chair with the person I'm working with. So I'll ask people, where would you like to sit? And the other question I follow up, I show them, this is my chair. Where would you like me to sit? Or how would you like for me to position my chair? That's an important question. Some of these might be givens. Maybe you have less flexibility to move things around, but even just asking the question with your awareness, being aware of who's got their back to the door. Would you look around the, I just invite people, would you look around the room and tell me anything here that appears to be of concern to you? And as we go through, people may notice things as they get deeper into the process, and they mention later. At the weekends, we're very aware of the physical space and the venues we choose to meet in, and what kind of things might be triggering to people. Something even as simple as the isolation of the venue, or the decorations, pictures, objects, and things that may inhabit the venue. We always go in and really carefully review that, and sometimes make some changes of taking a picture down from the wall or moving a statue, or et cetera. But I encourage you to just think about, in your own situation, how does the physical space communicate what you're doing? And for those of you who may have positions where you're more mobile, where you have to go with your car, or you have to meet somebody at a location, what are the small little places that you can position physical, how you're standing, how you're sitting, how you're interacting, what's going on around you? But your attention to that, whether you can make the changes, just your attention to that, it communicates something to who you're working with. Because so many people who have been victimized, who have experienced harm, it was done by total neglect, betrayal, overlooking the circumstances. And we need to be aware that our part is to launch into that process, make the entry in a very different way. Next slide, please. And this leads, and I invite you all to think about, some of you may want to put things in the chat with this. How do you let people in your agency know that you're open to working with men? What are some things that you've learned that communicates, or what range of men? For example, do you have any kind of messaging, in whatever way you might do that, that you're open to people with a spectrum of sexual orientation, or that you're open to working across gender, ethnic, racial lines? What kinds of things do you do to tweak your agency, your office, your publicity, the pictures? What kind of things? Just a second for anyone who wants to put in the chat something that might be helpful to share with everybody else who's here that you've learned to do about your messaging. Any ideas that you want to put in the chat? I go out in the community to spread awareness, yes, using ourselves that way. If we have flyers, if we have magazines, if we have things, those are kind of places to pay attention to. What kind of messages is that giving? Utilizing images of men in marketing efforts, yes. We try to have a survivor story in our newsletter, social media. Thank you. Yes, allowing our outreach to include the voices of the people we serve, rather than just the what kinds of things are we doing. Sharing fact about male survivors on our social media. Yes. One of the things about men as survivors is the invisibility that we have as a culture. So the more we can weave it in to make sure that people know that it happens, helps to invite people to reach forward to seek help. We have men-specific resources in our resource website. Yes, thank you. Okay, next, keep offering any things as you want, debunking myth about male survivors, the myth that our shelter does not serve males. Yes, we have to be active to let people know that we have doors open for that. Specifically name men as folks that we survive, but also specify trans men as the trans community continues to be overlooked at best or rejected at worst. Totally agree. Yes. Okay, next slide. So a couple of things that summarize a bit of what Sharon and I have been talking about today, kind of an overview. But when we're dealing with the issue of safety, remember that it's about the checking in process. It's the collaboration between us, no matter what, whether we have 30 seconds or 5 or 6 years working with people. How do we check in whatever amount of time we have to make sure that we're doing collaboration around safety and not just the quick way that maybe some of us have been trained? We figure out what would be safe, and then we tell the client, I'm glad you're here. I have a safe space for you. I'm glad you finally found your way to a safe space. Changing that and allowing it to be a check-in relational negotiation of sorts. Safety adjusts over time because it may change. As people get more safe and trusting with us, they may then be able to articulate or notice things that they've been afraid to say have been interference, or that they didn't know if they would be heard if they said it. They didn't know. So as we develop closer relationships or longer periods of time, things may need to adjust. Or as we work with a population of men who come in, we might, just like what Sharon was saying before, we thought we had done this brilliant intervention when we started doing body work about helping people bigify their bodies. And then we were stunned to realize that some of our people we're working with did not experience that as helping to make it safe. It was quite the opposite. We were proposing moving them into things that were unsafe, and we had to do the work of dismantling and letting go of something that we had an investment in. So safety allows adjusting. And then discovering. If we can begin to engage the people we work with, we're going to discover ideas about safety we may not have known before. And that our curiosity will help us discover new things. Sharon mentioned this before, but acknowledging that safety is never guaranteed. I think that's one of the problematic points, is that we communicate directly or indirectly. If you heal, then you won't ever be hurt again. If you do your work, you will be safe forever. And the reality is that healing allows us to respond to things that may not be safe, or to learn new skills to take care of ourselves. But it's not fair to communicate to people that we still won't be vulnerable to things that are difficult, hard, threatening, fearful, whatever. So we need to prepare everyone we work with that we're helping us learn about safety so we can be in a world that may not always be safe. And some of the people are living in environments that may not be safe for them. So when they come to wherever setting they're working with us, they may have to go back to someplace that's not, so we can't assume that everything we're engaging them or learning has immediate transfer value. Survival in an unsafe space may still be an issue. And then just the conversation, communicating where we can be transparent and honest about what's going on. Communicating, I think, has to have that extra added feature of transparency, so we can make it as safe enough to be as open as possible to share what's really going on. And then lastly, never assume. Always be prepared and invite being surprised by something that you may discover is really, really important about safety. The things that we think might be important sometimes are not at the same level of importance to the person we're working with. Next slide, please. Now, a couple of things just to incorporate that are important. For those of you, I'm sure most of you are already aware of this, but transference is the relational reaction that people we work with have to us, the things they see about us, the things they put on us, the image they have, the reminders, for lack of a better word. Countertransference is the reactions we have to the people we're working with, or the things that get stirred up. Most of us probably have been in environments where we were taught that transference is very healthy, it's very good, and countertransference should be avoided. And what I want to suggest is that if you expand the understanding of countertransference to paying attention to your own reactions honestly and your own experience, you may learn things that are very important about the dynamics of who you're working with. One very important thing, I have over the years done a lot of work with clients, survivors who have different degrees of dissociation. And they may be where they have separate parts, or they may just be kind of spacey or tuning out. And one of the things I've learned beyond just the questions I might ask people are my reactions. And countertransference requires that you have an ability to track your own process so you know when something pops out. Again, an example, I may know that I'm very rested, I'm getting plenty of sleep, and I have not had any sense of tuning out myself for 2 or 3 sessions I've done. And then all of a sudden, a session comes where I feel like I'm sleepy. I feel like I just want to, fatigued. That to me, a lot of times is a cue that someone might be dissociating. The air is being sucked out of the room. They're leaving. They're not present. And again, if I pay attention to that, rather than saying, oh my God, I'm being a bad person because I'm not paying attention, I say, that's interesting that all of a sudden I'm backing away or I'm moving out. I wonder what's going on in the room between us that I might need to pay attention to. And I may even as directly as say, did you just check out? Did you just leave? And sometimes, yes, there was a kind of a separation that happened. But pay attention and use some of your own experience clinically. And then always maintain a holistic framework that what we're doing in whatever space and time we have to interact with a survivor, we have to be aware of their larger context and where they are and the things that they're dealing with. Because what that will do is help us realize that sometimes people's moving away, backing away, taking space may not be resistance. It may be healthy spacing, timing, whatever, if we see in the context of other things that are going on in their life. So maintain and talk and get to know our clients when we have the opportunity for time to know as much as we can about the context within their working. And then lastly, it's so important that we take care of ourselves. We can't just be soldiers signing up for combat duty and we should be able to do anything. We have to do our own self-care. And for example, we go to workshops and so often the last segment of the workshop may be self-care. We need to reverse that and start with self-care. We need to realize that that's a primary value before we enter into any relationships with a survivor, and find ways within our work settings that we can have processes, procedures, protocols that promote self-care before we have to go out on the line and be the emergency responder, be the therapist, whatever setting we're in. How do we make sure that we are as solid, strong, grounded, as safe as we need to be to then work with the context of whatever crisis might be presenting itself? Next slide, Sharon.
Thank you. I think it's important that we set up a safe space for men to be curious about men, their experiences, all of that stuff. And with that safety and trust comes some things that might for us be uncomfortable. I myself have experienced misogyny, homophobia, transphobia when working with men. So I want to acknowledge that is, once we open sort of that safe space, that those things might be there as well. And it's important to discuss and explore. It's also important to recognize that we are not to be abused. And there are two different things. So it's important for us to also take care of ourselves as we build a trusting, safe space for others. Some things might come out that maybe make us feel a little less trusting and safe in that space. And so I want to invite all of you in caregiving, not in infantilization, to look back at the SEEK model that I talked about last session. And I want you to look at safety, empowerment, empathy, connection, and knowledge. And I want you to turn those tools back on yourself. That it's really important for us to also ask ourselves the question, what do I need in this moment in order to engage in my work? And so it's something just to be really thoughtful about, and particularly when issues of countertransference come up, but also vicarious trauma. It is an occupational hazard that those of us in the trauma field will experience vicarious trauma. It's not if, it's when. And so we need to be really thoughtful about that, because if we're experiencing that and not addressing it, it doesn't actually give us the capacity to work with folks on an individual equity level. It actually impedes our ability to be empathetic. So it's important for us to acknowledge it. So I want us to be able to use the SEEK model for ourselves. Next slide, please. So some examples of that is continuing to be as present as possible, being aware of what our body is doing and what it's telling us, particularly in certain spaces. And then asking yourself, not only am I present, how do I know I'm present, but what do I need right now to be in this space, right? To continue to be curious about yourself. Again, ABC, always be curious. So curious about, what do you need from yourself to do the work that you're doing? What do you need from others to do the work that you're doing? How do I know when I get what I need or don't? And being aware of that, and then again, continuing to advocate to get the things that you need. Transparency also, it's, what is my role? Do I stay within my role? Do I know what my role and my limitations are? And am I transparent about those things? Very often, people don't know this, but in the helping field, actually overextending, overpromising is actually something that we do in our field, and yet it's recognized or being seen as being productive. But actually, it's us stretching too thin. And so with that can come resentment, it can come annoyance, irritability, those types of things, even isolation. And then what very often happens, it's not just about us, but it also spreads to our annoyance, expectations and stuff of others. So being really aware of that. And then as Jim talked about, checking in is important. Things change, situations change. We never want to make assumptions that things are always static. So continuing to check in with yourself, is what I'm doing to take care of myself working? Am I getting what I need from others and from myself to do this work? Asking yourself, is this work impacting me? Well, more like it is. Maybe the best question is, how is this work impacting me? And being able, again, to address it and acknowledge it, to reduce the shame around it, to allow us to put tools into place to address it. And so again, I just invite everyone to take a look at the SEEK model and think about how you can actually utilize that model to address our own countertransference as well as our own vicarious trauma that gives us the space and capacity to be empathetic towards men and folks that we want to work with. So thank you. I'm going to pass it back to you, Jim. Jim, you're muted.
Yep. I just realized I was muted. Excuse me.
You said so many profound things, I'm sure, while you were muted.
I did in that 20 seconds, right? I want to leave a chance in the chat for people to perhaps identify, what are you taking away from this training? and how you use it in your work. And then I want to offer just a couple more summaries and some other resources. But at this point in our kind of bring it to conclusion before we go into Q&A, anyone like to comment on what you're taking away from today? What seems important to you about the time we've had together here? Let me move on to the next slide. Anyone who wants to add anything, I welcome you. Approaching to addressing safety. I appreciate how y'all didn't just say, don't assume. The training clearly reflects how you don't assume. It gave us concrete steps. Okay, what we hope that you're taking away, the importance of understanding what each survivor needs to engage to get their needs met. Explore how they know what they need, bring in the body. Again, it's really important that we keep realizing the integration of sexual harm as a physical, emotional, and cognitive. It's all those levels intersecting that we need to pay attention to. We used to help men come forward and look at myself in that setting, staying vigilant to the dynamic between myself and those I interact with. Yes. And creating a safe space takes time and constant communication, being aware of your countertransfer, and using countertransference is not that evil process we have to be afraid of, and not to see countertransference as a deficit, but see countertransference as actually being able to be solid and in tune enough that we don't ignore paying attention to ourselves as we're being so exquisitely present and paying attention with those we work with. And, one of the things I've learned over the years that's really valuable for the survivor clients, so many of them have learned to be so stoic, to tune out, to just be in survival mode all the time, crisis mode. And when I begin to let them know about myself and the things I do for self-care, the things I enjoy, how much a gift that sometimes is to them about, oh, I've never tried hiking before. Oh, I've never thought about taking up a activity like running or skiing. Oh, I've never thought about learning how to cook, perhaps starting a garden in my backyard so I can eat nutritiously, be in charge of my own food. Those kind of things that we can offer, or even images around the office that share those kinds of ideas, are gifts to survivors who have learned over maybe many years to just be in survival mode, to be in victim mode, to be in crisis mode. And I think we've mentioned this in the other sessions. A big component of our weekends of recovery is to bring people in through the process where by the time we get to Saturday evening, we're talking about joy and play and curiosity and excitement. Because I think stereotypically, trauma and therapy is about doom and gloom. And what we've tried to do is turn that around and make it about joy and thriving. So taking care of yourself is a real indicator that if we're taking care of ourselves, the people we work with may be drawn to doing that as well. Next slide, please. I want to put in a pitch. We've mentioned this before, but for any of you who are working in agencies around the country, sometimes finding enough men to start a group is problematic. You may be committed, you'd like to start offering services for men, but you only have 1, 2, 3, for example. Please note that MenHealing at our website, if you go to the landing page for our support group projects, we have a wait list for people to sign up for virtual support groups. We have alumni groups for men who've been through our weekends, but we also now have community groups that are for anyone who hasn't yet been to a weekend, but wants to come forward and begin to work on hope and healing. And we are starting partner groups for partners of survivors. And that's about partners learning how to attend to their own needs, not just becoming a better partner for their survivor loved one, but it's really a space to do their own work. So I really invite you to do that, because we can then put groups together across geographic boundaries, across the boundaries, and serve people in a variety of settings. So we've got a wait list for each of those, and we've now got about 37 of our men survivors that we've worked with through our process who've been trained to be peer leaders, and for them to, with our supervision, co-lead the management of those groups. So it's peer-to-peer with our supervision. Next page, please. And just the last page. Here are some resources that you may want to check into. These are opportunities for things that some of us within MenHealing have authored or co-authored. I invite you to check them out. If you again go to the MenHealing website, we have a publications page that allows you entry for some of these chapters and books to be downloaded as a free PDF. So if you're interested in any of these that talk about topics we've been dealing with in the entire series, some of these may be helpful for you. A reminder that next month will be our concluding session in this series, and we will be, it'll be titled Survivors Speak, and we'll have 3 men who are survivors who will be with us to talk about their experience of finding hope and healing, finding services, and available for Q&A with you as the audience. And Michael Munson, who is the executive director with Forge, that works primarily with trans and non-binary survivors, will be the moderator for that panel next month. I'll be here, Sharon will be here, Kenton will be here, but Michael will be helping with the moderation. So I invite you to come to Survivor Speaks. So let's lose. Some of you may want to drop off, go back to what you're doing, but anyone who wants to stay on, if you have questions in the Q&A, put them there and we can have some time that's remaining to answer, and the staff can feed those questions to us and we can answer. And thank you for your time and presence, and look forward to you being able to apply some of the things you've learned here to the direct work that you do with the men that you work with. Any questions?
I don't have any in the Q&A right now.
Okay. Okay, well, I guess if there's no specific questions for today, and maybe on your evaluations, we encourage you to take the time to fill out the evaluation, give any feedback. If there's any comments, questions from there, we have the ability to follow up on that, but we invite curiosity and more questions. Otherwise, thank you for all the work you're doing, and so much appreciate you taking the time to be part of these sessions.